Good evening, everyone, and thanks to I think it's thanks anyway to the Former Staff Association for allowing me to give this lecture. I say aloud, but actually it didn't quite work like that because it all came about because some time ago a couple of documents came into my possession, and those two documents sort of triggered my interest in the university's history. And I thought, well, yeah, okay, one could do something with this, and I happened to mention it in passing, and suddenly they said, oh, you should give a lecture on that. And it's all very well, but I wasn't really ready for that. And that was a couple of years ago, I think now. And the great thing is, because it's a couple of years ago, I've had a chance to gather more information. Many of you will know me, but for those who don't, I arrived at Kent in 1970, on the 3rd of October, reading electronics. And I was subsequently a postgraduate. I became support staff on the computer systems. I became academic staff in 1978, and then I ended up as Master of Darwin College in 1992 for 10 years. What I was going to say was I was taught by at least one person here today, but I know of at least 3 who are here today, which is really good. So that's a nice thing. I lived on campus for 6 years. And in a Darwin room, not very big, as you probably know. I've explored most of the university, and sometimes legally, sometimes not. There aren't many people who are familiar with the service ducts under Elliot, and I wouldn't say that I was, but you know. And I retired in 2015. I'm now on the Former Staff Association Liaison Committee. I occasionally give guest lectures. So there we are. I didn't think I had enough material, and I was worried that I would have about 15 or 20 minutes worth of stuff. It turned out to be a lot more than that. I've had to reduce it down to a reasonable length. I think it should last about 50 minutes to an hour, so we hope that's okay. And that means I have to concentrate on one part, and what I've concentrated on is really the first 15 years. I think they are the most interesting in many ways. There are many slides, but this is all right because I have a habit with students of giving them far too many slides and skipping over some of them, but then publishing the slides. And I do that because students don't buy textbooks anymore, so all the information has to be available to them. It's easier if I do that via slides or whatever. The slides will be available afterwards. You can go and download them and look at them at your leisure, including the pictures. And there's a website, which was on the first slide, but it'll come back at the end. I've created a website which supports this lecture, so you can go and look at it at your leisure. Oh, there's the website, in fact, sorry. So, why did I call it On the Move? Well, struggling for a title, to be honest. But people joked in years gone by that if you wanted to get to Canterbury, the easiest way was to hop on a passing college. And it's also about the university's move forward over the years, of course, and it's moved a great deal. It's mainly, but not exclusively, about the university's site. It's not about people, it's not about politics, internal or external, and God knows there's plenty of that. It's really about the site, but I'm going to add in a few snippets and anecdotes to sort of leaven it a little bit, and I hope that will work okay. And that, I think, will be, as W.S. Gilbert said, merely corroborative detail intended to give artistic verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. So there we are. It's not a complete history. As I said, the source material I have is from 2 particular periods, and then I've added stuff in between, which has come from people I've talked to, people I've known, documents I've seen, and so on. So it's come from myself, my memory of nearly 55 years here, friends, colleagues, books, documents, and even shuddering the internet. So, the university in Kent has been suggested for a very long time, and it started really where we're talking about universities back as just after the Second World War. But this really gained impetus in the late 1950s, and of course that was because there were a lot of 18-year-olds being born just after the war, and so we had a baby boom, and there was nowhere to actually educate them all at university level. So there was a preference in Kent to have somewhere that would be central or eastern. They didn't want to be contaminated with London, because you could get too closely associated with London. It's a separate university, and if possible with cultural significance. So University of Sussex did that. They got about as far away as they could by going down to Brighton. And despite Brighton's reputation, as they say, of a town that always looks if it's helping the police with their inquiries. That was Keith Waterhouse, I think, said that. The bids were put in by many places, some of which I never even knew about. Ashford, well, fairly obviously, Dover, Folkestone, Maidstone, of course, Margate, because it was thought they could use part of the Manchester Airport site, and Ramsgate Airport. How many people remember Ramsgate Airport? Yes, okay. That was where Pysons Road Industrial Estate is now, and it actually survived until 1968. But bids were put in from various places. There's a 16-page booklet, which you can see on the right there, the case for a University of Thanet. It has been rather nastily said that but we wanted somewhere with cultural significance. But on the other hand, actually, Thanet has got that. I mean, look at Dickens, Pugin, for example, and probably a few others. So that wasn't really totally fair. Now, the name was, I'm not sure whether it's on the next slide or not. No, it isn't. Let's just go back. The other thing to say is that the name was literally thought that they should have University of Canterbury. That was objected to by the county because they said, well, it's more than Canterbury, it's Kent. And the other thing was that the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, were very upset about it and wrote a very strongly worded letter. So we had to have something else, University of Kent at Canterbury. So the final site, well, they actually did say Canterbury possibly back in 1947. And it's an historic site, but actually Thanet is probably more historic actually when you think of the Romans. Approximately 300 acres at the time, which is, as I always used to say to applicants for degree programs, about 2.5 times the area of Vatican City, which is a useless bit of information, but there we are. But in 1962, various people were asked to do evaluations, and I did read somewhere, but I can't find it now, that there were 4 potential sites that were seriously considered, and O'Varrop and partners were asked to look at Canterbury as a particular site. Oh, there we are, I've got the University of Canterbury bit there. An early architect was the man who became Lord Holford, and he had all sorts of visions about the site. And as I said there, don't mention the tunnel. I mentioned the tunnel once, but I think I got away with it. And there's a bit there in the early report, which says the area is crossed by the tunnel of the now dismantled Canterbury to Whitstable Railway. Unfortunately, no record of the Strata encountered during construction could be found. And that's all they said in that preliminary report. That's all they said. To be fair, in 1964, 2 years later, there was another more detailed evaluation, and I'm sure more was said there, but I don't have that particular one. And the site was divided roughly east-west, and by the original line of Giles Lane, and I'll try and use the mouse pointer here. That there, if you can see the mouse pointer, is near Hospital Wood, is where the original Giles Lane went down. It actually went down, that's where Keynes College is now, just there, and it dived down and then went along and over the tunnel there and joined Hackington Road there. Now that was actually, that follows the line these days of the footpath that runs across the, just to the north of the 2 colleges, Eliot and Rutherford. So if you were to walk along the old the small part of Giles Lane, turn right by the Jarman building, and then follow around the front of Eliot and Rutherford. That's the old line of Giles Lane. But they wanted, I think, to try and enclose the site a bit better, and so they moved it. And what they did was they shifted it to where this footpath is, near enough. You can see a footpath up there, it's marked FP, and it joins Hackington Road further up. So that's where the new Giles Lane was built, and it's quite obvious, I think, to anyone that that part was constructed afterwards, because it's wider and straighter and everything else. So, there was a lot of compulsory purchase went on, and there were a lot of opposition to the compulsory purchase. In fact, so much so that the university didn't actually get formal confirmation that some of the stuff they'd built on was theirs until 1969, which must have been a bit of a relief when they finally got it. But there we are. And they, one of the compulsory purchases, one of the big ones, of course, was a farm, in fact, more than one farm. And that farm is Brotherhood Farm there. To this day, the boiler house is formerly known as the Brotherhood Boiler House. The farmer at Brotherhood Farm was not very happy. There is a picture which I didn't, I think it's in Graham Martin's book, which is in the references. And that there's a picture there of the sad farmer leaving his farm for the last time. But the Brotherhood Farm was there. There's a picture there of it. This is viewed from a point which is now roughly at the end of the Elliot Causeway, looking north or northeast. And you notice the pond as well. One of the interesting things about the site was it was actually quite wet. It's still quite wet. Anyone who used to walk along the front of Brotherhood College particularly has probably stepped on a paving slab that has then squirted water up their leg, because that seems to have happened quite a lot. So that was essentially the area. It wasn't the only farm. If we go back, there's also other farms around there. There's Hoath Court over there, to the top left, off the top left. And I think there was actually a hospital farm, but you can see there's Hospital Wood there. More about that in a minute. So, how suitable was the land? Well, there was a plateau at the top of the slope, fairly flat, and that plateau, of course, is is where quite a lot of the early university buildings were built. The library, Cornwallis, Gulbenkian, what's now Marlow, and the various others. They're all on that plateau. And then there's a slope down to Canterbury after that. The problem with the slope is that it's got ridges and hollows in it. And those ridges and hollows make it not very suitable for building. And one of the warnings that was given from the surveyors was that actually those ridges and hollows can't really be touched because they're not that stable. And that if you try to terrace it, you would have terrible trouble, and it wasn't recommended at all. So probably don't build too much on the slopes, and you'll see another reason for that in a minute. But don't build too much on the slopes, and don't try and do any clever things. So there's a good flat area at the bottom, which they thought, great, we have a sports field there, we can have a stadium, and that's actually in Holford's original plan. That would have been all right, except that the people who owned the land at the bottom, whoever they were, didn't really like this idea, and they outmanoeuvred the university and the council. What they did was manage to get a approval for alternative use for the land for housing. That in itself wouldn't have been bad, but that approval pushed the price of the land up so much the university couldn't afford it. So they had to abandon that piece of land altogether, which is about 40 acres, I think, something like that. And the other thing is that the council then provided some alternate land instead, which they ripped from two hospitals who owned land up there. St John's Hospital, which of course was in the town centre, it's at the one off Northgate, I think, and Eastbridge Hospital, which is in the town as well. And that includes Hoath Court. So basically they got areas to the northwest of where they already had land. And that was what happened. There's a cross-section which you really need to look at when you get to the website. This is an east-west cross-section, and it should be emphasised that the vertical scale here is being exaggerated by a factor of 5. to show more clearly the lie of the land. And on the left here we have Beverley Farm, as you can see. Further back, Brotherhood Farm over the hill there, and then St Stephen's Hill at that end. And the area that's got all those sort of little dashes on it, rather than anything else, that's all London clay. And it's actually pretty stable London clay on the plateau. It's quite reasonably solid, and don't mention the tunnel. It's reasonably solid, and then underneath there are various other things. And that can be found in the various documents if you want to know more detail. So the north-south cross-section, which I've just included really for completeness. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but you can again look at this on the website. The top one is the actual thing, but again exaggerated by a factor of 5, and the bottom one just shows you the reality, which is that it isn't all that steep. And you can see here that we have the clay, which is these little minus sign bits up to about there, and then the clay tapers away, and then it becomes sand, and various other things down there. There's also some stuff on top, which is really not too important because you could dig down for that if you had to. But the idea is that most of it is clay up to that point, and then it disappears and no longer becomes clay. Now the university's not building down there, that's far too far down the hill. Apart from anything else, apart from the geological problems of going down the hill, there are also other problems. The City Council is not too keen on building on the slopes unless it looks really nice and ancient or something. The City Council certainly were not very keen on anything that would spoil the view. So enough of that, you can look at that in more detail later on. Early days. I get sick of seeing this picture, don't you? You know, everyone sees that picture, so we're not having that, right? It's going, right? I'm just not going to bother about that. There are pictures, but really you don't want that one, do you? So, 1965, the university got the first 500. It's a lie. There weren't 500. More like 400 or 450. But it sounds like a nice round figure, doesn't it? And they weren't the first either, because, of course, staff had arrived, and these staff were people who had research students, and they came with them. So actually the research students were the first, and they came earlier than the first 500. So it's all a bit, the university actually put on a fundraising play. The idea was that they could get some money out of this for the university foundation. They had aimed to raise £4 million. What they actually had raised by that point was about 2 million. And they were getting a bit desperate, and they thought, well, publicity, perhaps we'll get some more money from that, and we might get some actual money from the play itself, not a lot. So they put a play on at the Marlow. The official name of the play is Sir Thomas More, and it was premiered around 1592, so a long, long way back. Shakespeare may have contributed to it, but then so did many other people. Everyone had a go at it, and there's no single author. It's a notable play because it has 59 speaking parts, and back in those days it must have been quite hard to get a company together to do that. It's 22 of them speak in the first 500 lines of the play. Now, whether it was known as the first 500, I have no idea. I suspect not. But it was a good thing on which to hang the play. So they called it the first 500 play. And so they produced a poster, which you can see on the right there, which the university used to publicise both the play and its foundation as well. Now, moving on, at this time there was no central hall in the university for activities. And it was always a thing, for many, many years, decades, why isn't there a students' union building? You know, every other university's got a students' union building. Well, they had no money, basically. There just wasn't enough money to do that sort of thing. So Eliot Great Hall, as it was called, would suffice. The Students' Union did get their own little building, which was the tiny building soon to be known as the Mandela Building, on the edge of Eliot Car Park. And later on they got a bit more, which was the Virginia Woolf Building, and then that name was stolen by the university for a new college. there were also monetary distractions. They weren't getting money for the foundation, partly because Winston Churchill inconveniently died in 1965. And Winston Churchill's funeral and all the subsequent, I won't say celebrations, but activities were taken up by various councils around Kent, and they put money into that. And a lot of other people did too. And what that meant was that they didn't have anything in the budget, or less in the budget, for contributing to the university. The other thing was, it was a local government reorganisation at that time, and part of Kent was effectively subsumed into London. And that took away some of the councils, it reduced the number of different councils, and again, that meant that money became tight. So it was quite sad, but that's what happened. Had there been a central hall, Lord Holford had an idea for exactly where it should be. It's really strange, this, because it should be, apparently, according to Holford, where the venue is now. So in a way, we finally got to a students' union in the place that Holford expected, but decades and decades later. And I don't know how many people remember this, some people here certainly would, that the sports hall was pressed into service for very large events. I remember setting up for those. What happened was that on day one, the day before the performance, the Students' Union people, all the officers and everything else, and all the junior college committees would get together and they would go to the sports hall, move away all the movable furniture in the main sports hall. There was only one then. And they moved that furniture into side rooms, to anywhere there was spare space. And then they had to cover the floor with a thick canvas sheet, with several of them laced together. It was a major operation. You could see at the time little hooks screwed into the skirting board all the way around for tensioning that and making sure that it didn't slide for safety reasons. So, and I partook in at least two of those preparations. So on day two, they would come in and construct a stage which was kept somewhere else on campus, and then the performance would take place that evening. And on day three, it was all torn down again. And so this didn't last very long. It took the sports hall out of service for 3 days as well, which didn't help matters. You couldn't have anything during exam time because the exams were happening in the sports hall. So it wasn't ideal at all, but that's what the sports hall did. But even before the sports hall was used, there were still some notable performances. Just before I arrived in spring 1970, they had The Who, and the year after, in spring 71 or thereabouts, they had Led Zeppelin. So they were certainly able to get the bands in. I know that even on my Freshers' weekend, I had the Incredible String Band, but they were obviously considered to be lesser, and they were in Kane's Dining Hall. Okay, so I'm going to say something about the colleges. You have to say something about the colleges. The college is very dear to my heart, particularly one of them. Holford's plan was for 10 colleges. That was the original idea, but money ran out after the first 3. They scraped together money for a fourth, which was Darwin College, and it was built for considerably less than the others. I think about 2/3 what Kane's cost, and probably even less when you compare it to the other 2. The names are interesting. T.S. Eliot died in 1965, and of course that was the obvious candidate, I guess, for trying to get a name for one of the colleges, the first one. So we got it Eliot College. That's humanities, so what we're going to have to do something different for the next one. So, Rutherford, we'll have a scientist. Let's have Rutherford, right? Ernest Rutherford died in the 1930s, but never mind. And then Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, social sciences. Why not have him as well? Now, none of these had great connections to Kent, which I always thought they did, but they don't. But they were just names that were chosen by, I guess, Senate and committees and everything else. So, Darwin was a bit of a tussle when it came to the name. Bertrand Russell had just died in 1970, and a lot of people apparently wanted Bertrand Russell to be a Russell College. But he wasn't the most popular person, as I'm sure a lot of you know. And so it wasn't universally accepted, but it went to the wire and very nearly happened. And I have a set of letters, which I haven't managed to dig out in time for this, but the letters are essentially a lot of letters from Brian Keith Lucas, the founding master, to various people, the good and the great, and we're talking Lord this, Lady that, and everything else, basically saying, I don't want Russell College, can you put your oar in, please? And there's a gap in the letters, and then suddenly, it's Darwin College. Russell insulted Brian Keith Lucas' father, and that obviously didn't help matters. Brian Keith Lucas' father was an engineer. His name was Keith Lucas. His first name was Keith, his second name was Lucas. He died during World War I, and his wife, or his widow, in his honour, changed the family surname to Keith-Lucas, which is why it's such an unusual name. You see very few of them around. The only one I've seen particularly is Sarah Keith Lucas, who works for the BBC and so on, and she is actually his great niece, I think. And you can see a family resemblance if you're careful, and that's not insulting Sarah at all. The other thing is that Charles Darwin's son, the original Charles Darwin, was Sir Horace Darwin, and he was around at the time, and he raised funds to support Brian, and he had two siblings as well, and that supported their education. His son, in turn, was Sir Charles Darwin, Sir Charles, I've forgotten, there's a bit in between name, Darwin, and his son was actually an honorary member of Darwin College, that was George Darwin. I've got one more thing to say there first, which is, I talked to George Darwin, and I said to him, well, it's very nice to have a Darwin College, and he said, well, actually, I have an affinity with two of the other colleges. And I said, really? And he said, well, yes, he said, because the Keynes family had intermarried with the Darwins for several generations here and there. I've met several Keynes people at Darwin Do's, particularly in Cambridge. The other thing is that I said, well, what's the other college? He said, well, Rutherford, he said. Really? I said, well, what's the connection with Rutherford? Oh, he said, Ernest was my godfather. Well, apparently he was known as Ern by the family, which I find really, really weird. That was quite nice. And we didn't find anything for Eliot, but much later on, I was talking to somebody else in the Darwin family. They alleged that one of the other members of the Darwin, one of the members of Eliot's, their family, had actually been scandalously involved with T.S. Eliot. So I suppose that sort of connects the Darwins again. Okay, now, what they did try and do was, instead of building any more colleges, was a housing estate. And that, of course, became Park Wood. And one of the reasons for that, one of certainly the justifications was that Park Wood was built pretty well on a design and build basis. And it was houses. So you could sell them off if the university got into serious debt. They could be sold as houses, and it wouldn't need much to do that. And eventually, many years later, we got Woolf and Turing, which don't have that much connection with Kent. Woolf actually lived in Sussex. I've actually had a picnic by the river where she died, where she killed herself. What was interesting about Darwin, and indeed the Sports Hall, which was much the same time, was they were brick built. The others were more of this sort of brutalist thing. I quite like brutalist stuff. Great fan of Arlington House in Margate, but they were done very differently. And most of the other buildings at the time, and we're talking sort of 60s and 70s, were named after their function. So we had a physics building, which is now Marlow. We had a chemistry building, which is now Ingram. We had a biosciences building, which is now Stacey. And I knew Stacey and Ingram, but I'm too young for Marlow. A long time too young. What I want to know is the Sports Hall going to become Wilkins? Perhaps it should. Anyway, the plan of the university was to change this and name them after people so that they could repurpose buildings quickly. My own department actually moved into a repurposed building just like that. And as it happens, I knew the person that's named after. So, I'm going to just say a little bit about how I arrived here and what happened. And I'm not going to say a lot, but one of the things on the website is a link to somewhere else where you can find my account of my early days in Darwin and indeed my time at university. I was lodging with Derek Butler's mother-in-law. How many people knew Derek Butler? Some people, yes, okay. Well, his mother-in-law was my landlady. She was lovely, really was. And one of the interesting things there was that he had a daughter who actually was married to Derek Butler. And that daughter had a little girl, and she was probably about that high when I met her, a little blonde girl. And I've since met her. She worked in the electronics or engineering building for quite a while, Catherine. I still see her occasionally. And you'll see a small picture of her later on. But I spent 6 years living in this Darwin student room, which was excessive in terms of what was normally allowed. One of the reasons it was allowed was because there were separate postgrad blocks. Even then, I was only marginally a postgrad. I was half-time university staff. But the Master's Secretary at the time was very helpful indeed, and she allowed me to have that room for 2 years. This turned out to be a good career move because I was a boss about 20 years later. There we are. The first thing I came to was a speech from the Master, Brian Keith Lucas. And it was a good speech. And what I didn't know, sitting there on the radiator in the corner, was that 22 years later, I would be given that same sort of speech. But there I was as a new master. Just some random facts about Darwin. When we arrived, it wasn't finished. I think any college was finished when people moved in. There were no waste paper bins, there were no real door locks, and there were a few other things. There's poor drainage in that corner of the campus, down by where the sort of porter's lodge was, the reception now. That poor drainage means that, certainly when I last looked, they still had pumps keeping Darwin's cellar dry. And there was a stream going down in that corner. Brian Keith Lucas was very keen on mixing staff and students, and so he had a shared bar, which went between the two common room corridors to try and get people to mix. The problem was it was too tiny. He also wanted to make himself very available to students, and so there was a separate door directly into his office to avoid the dragon, who was his Master's Secretary at the time, which wasn't the one that helped me. She wasn't really a dragon. And the last useless fact is that, if you don't know, there's an original tile kiln in the garden. Tyler Hill, of course, is named for the tile kilns. There's a lot of debris in the field across the road, and you can find the tile kiln actually in the garden. They did put a memorial tree in the middle of it, but there we are. So the next thing that was important for me was that I was an electronics student, and I had to actually go and do electronics, which I was never very good at, I have to say. And I arrived in October. They hadn't finished the building. It was still being built. And the labs opened just after Christmas, and I well remember my first lab on microwaves. One part of the building, a small part, wasn't finished for 40 odd years. It's a small plant room at the front of the electronics building, and I still call it that, although it's been repurposed, of course, as Jennison. And it's where you approach from the sports hall, the biosciences side. There's a small plant room as you go down the steps off to your right. And what they did was model a plinth on top of it, and that was for a statue. What statue? Well over 40 years, it was still flat as anything, no statue. Roger Jennison had a very crude early visualization, which I don't have handy, but one of them made us as far as a substantial model. The model was actually paid for and done by Roger Jennison himself. He was the first director of electronics. And that sculpture is actually a really nice piece of work. He did it himself. He was a member of the Canterbury Art Society. he did paintings of some of the masters of the colleges too. And it shows three standing figures, which are apparently Newton, Planck and Einstein, looking down on a fourth. And it's always been rumoured that the fourth one's Jennison. But the face is not clear. One wonders whether he would have liked to make it clear. But there we are. That's some pictures. They did produce an abstract sculpture called Snap Soleil, and that was 44 years after the plinth was laid. There's a larger version of that in the references. If you look at the front row on the left-hand side, I think that's Chris Barron is the first one, somebody will know him. The third one is, guess what, me. And the second one is that little blonde girl, Catherine, now grown up. I'm pretty sure that's her there. So, yes, and there are lots of others. You could probably see other people in that picture, particularly the guy on the right. So, yeah, it's a nice picture, but there's actually an entire newspaper article about it, and you can go and read that, or university article about it. You can go and read that. I've got the link for you. There's the Jennison idea, the proper model, and I will say no more about it. It's there. You can go and look at it in more detail. There's also a picture of the electronics building, as it was called then, under construction. This is from the roof of the chemistry building, which is now Ingram, and you can see it's sort of half constructed. The car park, I guess, was already there for the other building. The part to the right, of course, was eventually demolished, and that's now become the medical building. There's excavations for the pond. The pond is interesting. It's man-made. I don't know if anybody even knew that. Some people will have. The pond is man-made. It's not very deep. One of my fellow students was thrown into it, I remember. And there they are excavating it. And next part is when it's filled. Allegedly, Roger Jennison said this was for a Lloyd's mirror interferometer, which exists, it's a thing, and it was supposed to work with the structure that was later put on the roof, which I'm sure many of you have seen. Roger was good at blinding people with science. True science, but science all the same. I don't think I'm told that he never really had any intention of building a Lloyd's mirror interferometer, but he wanted a pond outside his building. And so they've got a pond outside his building. It's quite shallow, as you can see, from the excavations. It was shallow enough that it froze in winter, and people skated on it, which was quite nice. And in summer, it was a nice place to go and sunbathe. And I am told that at least two of the secretaries who worked in the building used to sunbathe in their bikinis, which caused a great pleasure, I think, among some of the male staff. So, let's move on to the tunnel. You've got to mention it eventually, haven't you? And actually, most of the rest of this is about the tunnel. The famous railway tunnel. It was constructed as part of the Canterbury to Whitstable Railway, which opened in 1830. It was dug from both ends, so from down near the Archbishop's School grounds, all the way up, and the other end is behind Giles Lane car park. There were problems because the ground was unstable in places, and it's quite clear that they actually were using quite poor quality bricks. They weren't consistent. Some were very hard bricks, some were very soft bricks from different parts of the brick kiln, and that turned out to be a bad thing. They used 2.4 million bricks for the entire tunnel, and that's a layered 4 deep all the way through. And 6 feet, which is about 6,000 bricks, being constructed every 24 hours. They did that by having the miners go in at night and dig another 6 feet and put temporary wooden supports up. And then the brickies would come in by day and add the bricks. And they kept pushing on that schedule for 400 days. And one gets the impression that they were either on piecework or they were on penalties or whatever, but they had to get it done. And so that explains some of the poor quality brickwork that has been observed since. That tunnel was sold to the university by British Railways in 1963, together with a piece of the line just north of Giles Lane. And the tunnel had 2 different cross sections. The part dug from the north end, Giles Lane, was oval in cross-section. And the idea of that is that it was in London clay. London clay is generally stable. And what they did here, you can see, is it's an oval cross-section. And the oval cross-section is what was used in a lot of Victorian sewers and so on. They just filled in the bottom part to make it flat. And that's basically two arches, a normal arch and an inverted arch, known as an invert. And that was done for the first 465 metres of the tunnel going south. And you can see it's quite a reasonable thing. It's higher than the other one because it has to have the flat bit in it. The other end was being constructed in sand, and they decided to use an arch with a flat bottom, as it were. So you can see there, they still had the brick rings, but they were used differently. And so there are two different forms of that tunnel depending on where you are. So the northern portion was in London clay, generally stable, they thought, and generally it was actually. That railway line existed until 1952, so it was, well over a century, and it was closed because it was uneconomic, and I think they'd only been using it for goods for the last few years. The line ran right into Canterbury by North Lane, and right down almost to Whitstable Harbour. So it was a useful line, I guess, but it became uneconomic as the roads got better and everything else. But the following year they opened it briefly again because Whitstable was cut off the main line due to flooding. And so they opened that up, but it wasn't long. Since then they closed it and they sealed both ends, which was turned out to be a bad plan. Bad plan because it reduced ventilation. They had all these railway trains running through it, and the trains were actually doing a really good job of whooshing the air through and keeping the inside dry. There was damp continually coming in through the walls, but it was being dried out. As soon as they closed it off, that ceased to happen, which was not a good idea. It was a common student activity at that time to walk through the tunnel. I've done this, and we didn't really understand the dangers. And we could do it because the barriers were being continually broken down. You could nearly always find at least one end or the other open. And that actually probably helped to preserve the tunnel by increasing ventilation a bit. But there we are. And there's actually, you can see there, an invitation to a party in the tunnel. There was more than one. And I think that's quite fun, actually. It says, please bring a bottle. Well, that's spelled all right, but a candle and a member of the opposite sex, which is desirable. I'm not sure that means it's desirable to bring one. You want to bring a desirable member, but there we are. Okay, I was just sent this a couple of days ago. A group of students after a tunnel trip at the North Portal near Wolf College today, Giles Lane, and you can see the oval shape fairly clearly there, disappearing into the ground. So just an interesting picture to look at afterwards. And this is really to tell you about where the tunnel was. It ran under the Cornwallis building, and the engineers gave these letters. So Block A is basically the eastern part of the original Cornwallis. It's got a plant room over the top. The main entrance to this day, over there on the top right. Block B is the part that's now truncated because it fell down. Block C is now the language area. That was previously in Block B. Block D was the bridge between that building and the Gulbenkian, and the Gulbenkian is sometimes called Block E as well. And you can see that major services were running underneath Block D. These are the I know one of the electrical intakes, one of the two university electrical intakes, ran under there, and that caused a problem. And you can see the tunnel going straight through the middle, under Block B and under Block C. I should explain the little CHs. CH200 and CH250 refer to the number of metres from the north portal of the tunnel. Why CH? It stands for chainage, because British Railways used to measure their everything in miles and chains. In fact, if you go and look at it, pretty well any railway bridge today, particularly if it's old, you'll find a little black and white oval on it somewhere, and it'll say something like 55M4CH or something, and it's distance from some reference point, which is usually the station in London. I think from here it's Victoria. It was known that the tunnel was potentially unstable right from the word go, and the university had in fact realised that from inspection that it was getting worse. And what they did was they tried to do something about it, and they had engaged contractors to fix it by doing repairs and or filling. But you can't really find fault with the university. I think they did the right thing at the right time, but they weren't prepared for how fast it was going to go. They thought that it would gradually settle. It didn't. On the 3rd of July 1974, there was ingress of clay into the tunnel, and that started the rot. There'd been minor clay ingress before, but this was much more major. And on the 10th of July, a lot more clay came in. And so it wasn't expected to be like this. 3 members of university staff were inspecting, actually, on the 11th, in the afternoon. There were low rumblings from the area of collapse, they said, and 3 loud reports from the bridge that ran across to Gulbenkian. And at 9 p.m. that day, the building began to settle. It took an hour, and it went down over 2 feet, just like that. And it was later found that Block C, which is now the language part, was almost unaffected, and it stands to this day. They were very lucky. They were worried about the plant room on the middle of Block B, which is still there to this day again. And here's an idea of how it all happened. There was a depression, and these are sort of negative contours, if you look. Well, they're positive contours, but they show how deep the thing came. At the middle of that depression, it was actually 2 meters deep. So it went down a long way. You can't really tell that from the photographs, but that's how deep it was. You can see that Block D and Block B really stood no chance at all. This is a picture which is a well-known picture. I think many people have this. I have several different copies. And this shows you can see the drunken state of the bridge because what's happened here is that the Cornwallis building here has sunk by about 2 feet. And the end of the bridge has gone down with it. And it's pretty horrific, really. That's a picture from the front, again another well-known one, and you can see that first of all it's all tilted, and secondly there's pretty major damage. You can see large cracks there, and you can see the sunken ground a bit better there as well. So again, you can inspect those in detail afterwards. Block B broke its back. It actually snapped off, broke quite badly, quite a long way along, and the red arrow there shows you pretty well where it was. Some of the stuff to the right of it had to be demolished, and that's why to this day you see a rather truncated left-hand side. Cornwallis is asymmetric now, the front part. And these are some elevations which you can expect in detail. You can see where all the cracks are, and that red arrow is pretty well in the same place. And if you look round the side, you can further along, you can see where the link block is, the bridge. And how it dropped by about 0.7 metres at the top, that roof line. They had to demolish the Gulbenkian Theatre really fast. They had no choice because the Gulbenkian Theatre was in serious danger. There was twisting motion on it, and the actual structure itself was being threatened. So they had to disconnect that bridge fairly rapidly and take it away. So that's what they did. And that's what you're seeing there. Then, of course, they had to demolish most of the western side of, most of Block B. The part of Block B that hasn't been demolished there, on the right-hand side, this part, stands to this day. It has 3 small offices up there, I know. I'm not sure about the ground floor now. And it's very spectacular. So they had to take all of that away fairly quickly. That wasn't the only danger. It was worse than that because, of course, the tunnel ran further south and it ran under Rutherford College. And that was actually not so bad but they had to stabilise it, and so they were pumping the same sort of stuff down to fill the tunnel as they were further up. They used something by the way called PFA, which is pulverised fuel ash from power stations. You mix it in I think it's a 10-to-1 mix with concrete, or cement rather, and you pump that in. It's fairly fluid, but it hardens. And not only were they filling up the hole, they were also pushing it out sideways because they've got a very low stress in a horizontal direction in the clay, and it has to be higher than that for the clay to be stable. So they pushed it outwards, and they pumped a lot of stuff in until it stopped moving. And they did a lot of measurements of stress in the clay with bore holes and everything else. So why did it happen? As I said before, I don't think there was any real negligence. There were regular checks, action was being taken, but that failure happened really, really quickly, and we'll see why in a moment. What happened was that the invert, in other words, the bottom arch of that oval, failed, and the clay was gradually entering the tunnel. And that accelerated because there was no proper support for the wall above it. And that left a void above the tunnel. And that void above the tunnel was quite big, and above that was a smooth clay plug all the way to the surface. And one day the clay plug said, "Oh, I'm not having this," and just dropped. And when it dropped, it left the void at the surface, and it took part of the Block B's foundations with it. And so Block B had no chance at all. And the rest is history. There's a diagram which you may have seen part of elsewhere. This shows the cross-section of on the left-hand side, the cross-section of the tunnel when it was built. And you can see it's the oval shape with the earth or with infill at the bottom there. The floor heaved. Why it heaved is probably to do with damp. It's suspected that nobody quite knows, but the theory is that the bricks failed because they were damp. It was particularly damp underneath. And of course they weren't being inspected really under that so much. So the invert failed. The side wall then failed because there was nothing really to stop it, and it bent, and that formed a big cavity to the left. I've got pictures of somebody looking into that cavity. It's fairly substantial. That left a lot more, meant that the rest of the tunnel could then come down into the hole, which was part of the tunnel itself, and left this massive intermediate cavity at the top. And then, of course, the clay plug went downwards, and that was the end of it. There's a picture of one of the pictures of the clay fall above the breach. And that was 2 days before when they were inspecting. And you can see that that's the top of the tunnel, but there's a massive hole there and a big cavity above it, and clay just sitting there in the tunnel. Aftermath, well, power and other services had to be rerouted because cables were next to Block C and D, as I said. The university's main, in fact, the only computer, apart from a small one in chemistry and possibly in physics, had to be moved. Oh, there was a small substation as well for electricity, and that had to be moved or taken away. But the university computer got moved from the what was the western end of Block A. In other words, as you go in the main entrance, immediately to your right, and it was moved, not that much, as far as they could, to the only other air-conditioned area at the eastern end. And it got moved back in 75 or 76, not quite sure, in time for a new computer to be delivered. There was monitoring for cracks in Cornwallis and, of course, in Rutherford. One of the monitors was gluing a glass tube across the cracks in the wall, and then you'd wait for them to go pop, and that meant it was still moving. There were also measurements taken, of course. So, what's happened to the present? The engineers were very careful to stabilise the stresses in the clay in both directions. They really took a lot of care in what they were doing. They became confident through subsequent boreholes for the next few years that the stresses were correct, there were no more voids and everything else. But if one wanted to build further down the hill, if the City Council would let us, that would require more filling with PFA. The tunnel is not totally filled all the way down. Vast numbers of cubic feet of PFA were used, and it was recommended that the portion of the tunnel crossing the surface and foul water sewers be filled. They're a little way down the hill, behind Rutherford and Elliot. I do know that certainly one of the sewers ran near the Rutherford bungalows, as it were, which are now where Tyler Court is now. And there was a leak there for quite a long time. And the leaks, I think also the incoming main, and it resulted in the university having an unnaturally high water bill until they discovered the leak was not on their side of the main, but on the water company's side, and they got a lot of money back, which was quite nice. So there were, 15 years later, no significant movement, and they built Cornwallis Southwest, which occupies part of that space, as you know, still straddling the tunnel. And the link bridge has been rebuilt, so we can now walk again from Cornwallis to the Gulbenkian. And in terms of the tunnel location, many of you will know about the Footsteps path. This is a path which is built using something akin to railway tracks, railway lines, and it's filled with bricks where you can buy you can buy a brick and have it engraved with some message about you or somebody you knew or whatever, and have that laid in that path. I've had a friend, sadly, who died, commemorated there. I was going to do another one, but apparently they've stopped taking donations, which is a shame. And that runs between Cornwallis and the vicinity of Sennet. It's very clear, you can see it, and it's worth going to look at if you haven't. That's the end, except, rather like Colombo, just one more thing. Acknowledgements, first of all, to all these people, and I won't read them all out, but I've probably forgotten people. If I've forgotten you or anybody you know, let me know and I'll add it to the website. But there are lots of people, a lot of people from the electronics building, as it happens, because I knew them and still know them. And the references, I've put them, it's difficult to copy down a URL off the screen or anywhere else, so I've set up a web page. That web page contains really everything you need to know. All you need to remember is ukcmove.bobeager.uk. There's no .co.uk, it's just .uk. Go there, you will find all the details you need. Okay.
Thank you very much, Bob. You did say at the beginning that you'd be prepared to answer one or two questions. As I said right at the beginning, if we could keep the questions short, if we want to have discussion, let's go to the bar and do that together as we learn about what we walk over every day most of the time, but we never knew its history. So thank you, Bob. Does anybody have any intriguing